On July 15th, in the state of Florida, the government carried out the execution of Michael Bernard Bell by lethal injection. No matter how many times the death penalty is carried out, each execution carries the weight of two separate tragedies. One belongs to the victims whose lives were taken. The other belongs to the moment when a human being crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For Michael Bernard Bell, that line was crossed in December of 1993, when two young people were shot to death outside a Jacksonville nightclub. Two lives ended within seconds. Two families were forced into a lifetime of grief. And a legal process began that would stretch across more than 3 decades. This is not a story about sensationalism. This is not a story about glorifying violence. It is the documented account of what happened, how it happened, and how a single night reshaped dozens of lives forever. If you want deeply researched true crime stories grounded in real cases and real consequences, subscribe to the channel now. Let's begin. Michael Bernard Bell was born and raised in Florida. He did not grow up famous. He did not grow up wealthy. He did not grow up expecting to become part of the state's death penalty system. Those who knew Bell in his earlier years described a young man who moved in and out of unstable environments. School records and family accounts paint a picture of a childhood marked by inconsistency. There were periods of relative normalcy. There were also periods of disruption. Like many individuals who later become involved in violent crime, Bell struggled to maintain structure. He gravitated toward peers who were already engaged in risky behavior. Petty offenses came first. Minor run-ins with law enforcement. Short stays in juvenile detention. None of these early incidents predicted murder, but they established a pattern. Rules were flexible. Consequences were temporary, and accountability never felt permanent. By the time Bell reached adulthood, criminal behavior had become familiar territory. He had prior convictions. He had been incarcerated before. He understood how the system worked. That familiarity would later matter, because it meant Bell did not act out of ignorance. He knew the risks. He knew the penalties. He chose to proceed anyway. December 9th, 1993, was an ordinary Thursday night in Jacksonville, Florida. People gathered outside a local nightclub. Music played inside. Groups talked in the parking lot. Cars came and went. Among those present were two young people. Jimmy West, 23 years old. Temeka Simmons, 18 years old. They were not public figures. They were not criminals. They were young adults spending an evening out. Friends described Jimmy West as laid back and social. Temeka Simmons was described as outgoing, with a wide circle of friends and a strong connection to family. They had plans. They had futures. Neither had any idea that the night would be their last. According to trial testimony, a dispute erupted between Michael Bell and people connected to Jimmy West. The exact origins of the argument varied among witnesses, but what was consistent was the escalation. Words were exchanged. Tensions rose. Instead of walking away, Bell left the scene. That moment matters, because leaving gave him time. Time to cool off. Time to reconsider. Time to choose a different path. Instead, Bell went to retrieve a firearm. He armed himself. He returned. That sequence established intent. This was not a spontaneous accident. This was a decision. When Bell returned to the area outside the nightclub, he did not fire warning shots. He did not attempt to intimidate. He opened fire directly into the group. Multiple rounds were discharged. Jimmy West was struck. Temeka Simmons was struck. Both collapsed. Panic erupted. People ran. Some hid. Others screamed for help. Emergency services were called, but the damage had already been done. Jimmy West died at the scene. Temeka Simmons was transported to a hospital. Doctors attempted life-saving measures. She later died from her injuries. Two young people were dead within hours. Bell fled. News of the shooting spread quickly through Jacksonville. Families were notified. Friends gathered. Grief set in. Jimmy West's family described him as a son who loved music and family gatherings. Temeka Simmons' relatives described a teenager who had just begun stepping into adulthood. Graduations, careers, marriage, children, all of it disappeared in seconds. For law enforcement, the focus turned to identifying the shooter. Witnesses came forward. Descriptions matched Michael Bell. Bell's name was already familiar to police due to his prior record. An arrest warrant was issued. Bell was located and taken into custody. Detectives reconstructed the timeline. Witness statements placed Bell at the scene before and after the argument. Several individuals testified that Bell had left and returned with a gun. Ballistics evidence confirmed the type of weapon used. Shell casings matched the firearm connected to Bell. The case did not rely on a single piece of evidence. It was built through layers. Eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, timeline reconstruction, prior interactions. Together, they formed a clear narrative. Michael Bell intentionally armed himself. Michael Bell returned. Michael Bell fired into a crowd. 2 people died. Bell was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. At trial, the state presented evidence showing premeditation. They emphasized Bell's decision to leave, retrieve a gun, and come back. They highlighted that neither victim was armed. They argued that Bell demonstrated complete disregard for human life. The defense attempted to introduce mitigating factors. They spoke about Bell's upbringing, his troubled childhood, his prior exposure to violence. They argued that life imprisonment without parole was a sufficient punishment. The jury rejected that argument. Bell was found guilty on both counts. During the penalty phase, jurors considered aggravating and mitigating factors. Aggravators included multiple victims, cold, calculated actions, prior violent felony convictions. The jury recommended death. The judge imposed 2 death sentences. Michael Bernard Bell was sent to Florida's death row. Death row is defined by isolation. Inmates spend most of their time alone. Movement is tightly controlled. Human contact is limited. Days blend together. Weeks become indistinguishable. Years pass quietly. Bell spent decades inside this environment. He filed appeals. His attorneys challenged jury instructions. They challenged sentencing procedures. They raised constitutional claims. Courts reviewed each filing. State courts, federal courts. Each time, Bell's conviction and sentence were upheld. No court found error significant enough to overturn the verdict. Time continued to move forward. Bell aged. His hair turned gray. His health declined, but his legal status remained unchanged. Condemned. While Bell waited on death row, the families of Jimmy West and Temeka Simmons lived with the consequences. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed. Graduations occurred. Weddings happened. But 2 seats remained permanently empty. Family members gave victim impact statements over the years. They spoke about the loss, the anger, the sadness, the unanswered questions. For them, the case was not a legal file. It was personal. It was permanent. In 2025, Florida's governor signed Michael Bell's death warrant. An execution date was set for July 15th. From that moment forward, Bell's remaining legal options narrowed. Attorneys filed last-minute motions. Clemency petitions were submitted. All were denied. The execution moved forward as scheduled. In the days leading up to July 15th, Bell met with attorneys. He met with spiritual advisors. He made phone calls to family members. He was offered a final meal. He declined to make any public statements proclaiming innocence. There were no dramatic reversals, no new evidence, no last-minute stays. On July 15th, Michael Bernard Bell was escorted into Florida's execution chamber. He was strapped to a gurney. Intravenous lines were placed. Witnesses observed from behind glass. The lethal injection protocol began. Within minutes, Bell lost consciousness. Shortly afterward, he was pronounced dead. He was 54 years old. Michael Bernard Bell's story is not about spectacle. It is about choices. a decision to walk away, a decision to return, a decision to pull a trigger. 2 young people lost their lives. 2 families lost children. A community lost members. A man lost his freedom, then his life. Nothing about this story represents victory. It represents consequence. It represents what happens when anger is given control. If you want more true crime stories built on verified facts, careful research, and respect for victims, subscribe to the channel. More cases are coming. More stories need to be told. And more lives deserve to be remembered. The last prisoner executed in July 2025 is Sylvia Zakrzewski. On June 9, 1994, in Mary Esther, Florida, a quiet residential street became the location of one of the most devastating family murders in modern American criminal history. Inside a single home, 3 people were killed within a short span of time. Sylvia Zakrzewski, 34 years old, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Edward John Kim Zakrzewski III and 5-year-old Anna Zakrzewski. The person responsible was their husband and father, Edward James Zakrzewski II, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force. Decades later, after years of court proceedings and appeals, the state of Florida carried out his sentence by lethal injection. What makes this case endure in public memory is not mystery. There was no masked intruder. There was no unsolved puzzle. The facts were established early and never seriously disputed. A man killed his own family, fled, surrendered months later, pleaded guilty, and spent nearly 30 years on death row before the state ended his life. The endurance of this case comes from something far more unsettling: its clarity. Zakrzewski was born in Michigan and later enlisted in the United States Air Force, eventually being stationed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. To co-workers and neighbors, he appeared disciplined, orderly, and dependable. He had a steady career, a wife, and 2 children. On the surface, his life resembled that of countless other military families living in base communities across the country. Yet beneath that appearance, the marriage was deteriorating. By 1994, Sylvia Zakrzewski had decided she wanted a divorce. Divorce in itself is not rare. It occurs millions of times each year. What separated this case from ordinary marital collapse was how Zakrzewski responded to the prospect of losing his family unit. Evidence later presented in court showed that on the day of the killings, he purchased a machete during his lunch break. The timing of that purchase would become central to the prosecution's argument that the murders were planned rather than spontaneous. That evening, Sylvia returned home with the children. What followed was a sequence of violence that unfolded room by room inside the house. Sylvia was attacked first. She was struck with a crowbar, strangled with a rope, and also injured with the machete. After killing his wife, Zakrzewski turned his attention to the children. Both Kim and Anna were killed with the machete. Autopsy reports documented defensive wounds, indicating the children attempted to protect themselves. When the violence ended, Zakrzewski did not call for help. He did not remain at the scene. He left Florida. Using cash and false identification, he traveled across the country and eventually reached Hawaii. The home where the murders occurred sat silent, containing the bodies of 3 family members who would not be discovered until later. Law enforcement quickly identified Zakrzewski as the primary suspect. A nationwide manhunt began. His photograph was circulated, and his name appeared on wanted bulletins. For approximately 4 months, he remained at large. The case gained national attention when it was featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries. The very next day after the episode aired, Zakrzewski turned himself into authorities in Hawaii. His surrender did not involve a dramatic standoff. There was no chase. He walked into a police station and identified himself. From that point forward, the case moved out of the realm of search and into the realm of prosecution. In 1996, Zakrzewski pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. A guilty plea in a capital case does not spare a defendant from sentencing proceedings. Instead, it shifts the focus toward whether aggravating factors outweigh mitigating factors. Prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the killings, the vulnerability of the victims, the presence of planning, and the fact that two of the victims were young children. The defense presented evidence about Zakrzewski's background and mental health. The jury recommended death. The trial judge imposed 3 death sentences. From that moment forward, Zakrzewski entered the long phase that defines most American death penalty cases: post-conviction litigation. His attorneys filed appeals in state court and federal court. They challenged the effectiveness of trial counsel, the constitutionality of Florida's sentencing procedures, and aspects of the jury instructions. Over the years, each court rejected his claims. His convictions and sentences were repeatedly affirmed. Time on death row is measured differently than ordinary time. Years blend into decades. Prisoners live within rigid routines. Outside the prison walls, judges retire, prosecutors change offices, governors are elected and replaced, and public opinion about capital punishment rises and falls. Yet the sentence remains in place. By 2025, Florida had become one of the most active execution states in the country. Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant for Zakrzewski, setting July 31, 2025 as the execution date. In the weeks that followed, his attorneys filed last-minute motions seeking to halt the execution. They argued issues related to mental health and the state's lethal injection protocol. Courts denied each request. On the evening of July 31, 2025 at Florida State Prison, Zakrzewski was strapped to a gurney and given a lethal injection. He made a brief final statement. Witnesses observed as the drugs were administered. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead. Florida recorded the execution as its 9th of the year. The state's action closed the legal file. It did not restore the lives that were taken. At the center of this case are 3 people whose identities risk being overshadowed by the notoriety of their killer. Sylvia Zakrzewski was a young mother seeking to leave a marriage she no longer wanted to remain in. Kim was 7 years old, an age defined by school days, cartoons, and childhood curiosity. Anna was 5, an age defined by dependence and trust. Their deaths occurred not because of strangers, not because of random crime, but because of a decision made by someone who was supposed to protect them. Cases like this force uncomfortable recognition of a recurring pattern in violent crime. The most dangerous situations often emerge inside private spaces. The most lethal threats are frequently people who are known, trusted, and emotionally connected to the victims. Zakrzewski's story does not contain hidden conspiracies or unresolved questions. It contains a straightforward chain of events: a marriage collapsing, a man purchasing a weapon, a family killed, a fugitive period, a surrender, a guilty plea, decades of appeals, and an execution. The simplicity of that sequence is precisely what makes it disturbing. Violence in this form is not explosive chaos. It is deliberate. It unfolds step by step. It begins long before the first blow is struck. On June 9, 1994, 3 lives ended inside a home in Mary Esther. On July 31, 2025, Florida ended the life of the man who caused their deaths. Between those 2 dates lies the entire story. If you value carefully researched criminal cases presented with accuracy and restraint, subscribe to the channel. Each case is built on verified records, court documents, and credible reporting. New stories are released daily.